Welcome to the podcast discussion. We're diving into that provocative interview by George Koo about whether containing China is making America weaker.
Absolutely, there's so much to unpack in his discussion. What really struck you in his analysis?
Well, the whole discussion of US policy towards China was front and center. Koo argues that America's attempts at containment might actually be leading us down a self destructive path, you know? It's a daring perspective that challenges the common narrative.
Right, and that also touches on his point about US foreign policy being overly emotional and reactive. I mean, are we playing politics or strategic defense here?
Exactly. He points out that by having these emotion based policies, America might be undermining its own strength rather than fostering a stable balance. It's like
Yeah.
chasing a ghost sometimes.
You know, one of the striking segments was his take on growing up in China. It seemed like his background informs his views on how money and power shape political decisions.
Oh, totally. He essentially connects that personal history to the broader theme of how money controls America's democracy. It's almost like our political system is being hijacked by financial interests. That really resonates with current debates.
And he doesn't hold back when discussing the US government's internal problems, does he? The segment on the problem with US government really lays bare some uncomfortable truths.
Indeed. Koo argues that too much of America's challenge stems from its own structural weaknesses and the double standards, like when he mentions how figures like Nancy Pelosi fit into this puzzle. It's a
Yeah.
raw critique that definitely makes one pause.
Speaking of double standards, what did you think about his insights on America's backsliding democracy and the notion of decoupling from China?
That was one of the heftiest parts. On decoupling, he questions if it's even feasible without sacrificing economic stability. It's like teaching an elephant to dance, right? It's a challenging balancing act.
And it's interesting because he pushes back on the idea that decoupling would be a silver bullet for national security. Instead, he suggests that encircling China could backfire.
Absolutely. The interview stresses that containment might weaken America overall because it hampers necessary economic and strategic collaborations. It's a
Yeah.
bit like locking your door only to find that you're shutting yourself in.
What about his suggestion on why Xi Jinping and Biden should meet more constructively? That was a compelling call for dialogue rather than strict opposition.
Definitely. Koo argues that a direct summit could help both sides address mutual interests instead of escalating tensions. Sometimes a handshake goes further than a missile, if you know what I mean.
There's an interesting interplay here. With America's more emotional stances and China's strategic maneuvers, it almost seems like both are in a perpetual cycle of mistrust.
Right. And Koo does a great job of highlighting how these emotional responses are tied to the political and economic pressures dominating both nations' policies. It's like reactionary chess on a global board.
And he brings in the topic of criticism, pointing out that while we're quick to criticize China, we rarely scrutinize America's own internal issues. Wasn't that at the start of the interview?
Exactly. He challenges us to be equally critical of our own system. His discussion around can we criticize America and China invites a more balanced and nuanced debate. Balance is key if we truly want to improve policies.
But, I do wonder, don't you think his criticism sometimes oversimplifies the complex nature of these geopolitical dynamics?
That's a fair challenge. While his points are incisive, some may argue that he risks painting with too broad a brush, it's like reducing a symphony to just a couple of notes. The nuance might get lost.
Exactly. But still, his perspective certainly shakes up the prevailing mindset and forces us to rethink our assumptions about power and containment.
For sure. It's a reminder that both internal democratization issues and external policy missteps can work together to weaken a nation's global stance.
Yeah.
It's an intertwined web.
And then there's his point on working with China is a win-win. It might seem counterintuitive given the current climate, but it carries a lot of practicality.
Absolutely. It's like saying that instead of fighting a natural force, why not learn to ride the wave? Koo suggests that a cooperative approach might actually bring economic benefits and stabilize international relations. It's a refreshing perspective.
I really liked the way he tied in economic interest to diplomatic efforts. He's pointing out that money and politics are inseparable. Isn't that right?
Yes, and that's where his segment on how money controls America's democracy comes into play. He makes it clear that financial powerhouses have a massive influence over political decisions, which then influences foreign policy choices. It's like a
Yeah.
cycle that's hard to break.
And speaking of cycles, Ku's observations about America's backsliding democracy highlight that domestic challenges can ripple outward, affecting our global strategy.
Exactly right. When our democracy, with all its internal contradictions, starts to falter, it creates vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit. It's almost like our house is crumbling from the inside out while we're busy picking fights abroad. I totally see that.
Now, considering all this, do you think Ku's envisioned solution of more rational policies and direct dialogue is realistic in today's political climate?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? His suggestions for a meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden and fostering more calculated policies are idealistic, like, aiming for a perfectly balanced equation. But given the current polarizations, it may be a tough sell.
Precisely. There's a lot of inertia in political systems that thrive on division and drama. Ku's idea of stepping back from emotional decision making might sound easier in theory than in practice.
True, but sometimes ideas need to push the envelope to spark a change. His call for a decoupling reconsideration, for instance, challenges conventional wisdom and might just be the kind of disruptive thought process we need,
Yeah,
eventually forcing a debate that's overdue.
I agree. Even if we don't adopt his views wholesale, they at least open up the conversation about whether America's strategy towards China truly serves its long-term interests.
Exactly. And let's not forget, his discussion underscores that weakness may not be solely the result of external pressures, but also the product of internal mismanagement and political short-sightedness. Self-reflection is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
I love how he ties in accountability at every level, from elected officials influenced by money to overarching foreign policy doctrines that may be more emotional than logical.
You know, it's like a domino effect. Missteps in domestic policy spill over into international relations and vice versa. Ever connected, right?
Absolutely, and it seems that acknowledging these intertwined challenges is the first step in addressing them. So, would you say that containment is a misstep rather than a safeguard?
I'd say it's a double-edged sword. Ku clearly intimates that containment, while seemingly strong on paper, can end up undermining America's own foundation if it ignores internal reform and the nuances of economic interdependence.
Exactly.
The remedy might lie in rebalancing both our domestic priorities and our international strategies.
And that, in essence, is what makes this interview with George Ku so thought-provoking. It boldly asks us, are we fighting external threats at the expense of our internal strength?
Precisely, it challenges us to rethink narrative assumptions. Instead of letting fear and emotion dictate policy, maybe a pragmatic and holistic approach is needed to ensure stability, both at home and globally. A sound argument indeed.
Well, it's been a real eye-opener discussing these points. His insights force us to consider that sometimes what appears as strength on the outside hides fractures internally.
Absolutely. While not every point may fully resonate with all critics, Ku's interview certainly sparks a much-needed conversation on the interplay between domestic policy and international strategy,
Yeah.
making us all reflect on the bigger picture.
Thanks for that engaging discussion. It's great to discuss such multifaceted issues with clarity and depth.
My pleasure. Till next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the toughest critiques lead us to the strongest solutions.